20 years ago, if you saw an elk, it was wonderful. And at that time, I enjoyed elk. It was magnificent to see them in the forests, running through the trees, etc. But now, when I view an elk, I panic. And I want that elk gone as quickly as possible. Letting the brucellosis disease remain unchecked in the elk population just leads to the perfect storm.
Brucellosis is a bacterial disease. It's harbored inside infected animals, and it hides in tissues and lymph nodes. It's really very efficient in spreading from one animal to another.
It didn't happen overnight, and it's not going to leave overnight. We've known about brucellosis in elk since the early 1900s. It wasn't until the 1980s where we actually started conducting surveillance and really actively looking for it. Basically, we've seen an increase from under 1% up to almost 12 to 17% in different areas.
It's spreading not only in the rate of disease, but also in the geography. Brucellosis in elk significantly reduces the tolerance of landholders or cattle producers for wildlife on their properties. Unfortunately, the trend is discouraging in the way that the problem seems to be getting worse and not better. The livestock industry is tremendously important, not only to the economy of Montana, but also to the social identity of this state. And there's also romanticism and a lot of history with ranching and livestock in the state of Montana.
The most challenging aspect of ranching are all the things that you have no control over. Whether it's drought conditions and you don't have irrigating water, whether you're trying to put up hay and it's raining all the time, whether you're trying to calve your babies and it's 20 below. And now one of the other big problems is that we have no control over diseased wildlife. And that is proving to be quite a problem for all producers. Years ago, the seroprevalence in the wildlife was much less. Their dispersion and movement patterns kept them far away. So that was when if was the word we used. If we would ever, by any small chance, get brucellosis. That changed. Now it almost becomes a matter of when that happens. The elk come in the months of February, March, April. They would migrate out of the park, but we never ever saw them down here until they had a new predator, which pushed. And once the elk have been here, they have this established migratory pattern now. And there hasn't been anything to put them back the way it was. And so now this behavior has become learned. They spend a lot of time on the valley floor where they don't belong, but it's safe. They do so in greater numbers than ever before. So there's just many, many more chances for commingling of livestock and elk.
Brucellosis is spread primarily through an abortion event where that bacteria is shed in the birth materials.
Really, when those animals abort or calve, other animals come into contact with those tissues, and then they in turn get infected, and the cycle repeats itself.
If they abort on your ground, the bacteria has the ability to live up to 60 or 90 days depending on conditions. It can stay active for a very long time.
We don't have a silver bullet. We don't have one technique or one activity that is going to be 100% effective. So therefore we have to use a compilation of techniques to try to minimize the opportunities for that transmission. One of the things that we do is aggressive vaccination, and we do use that.
Other than vaccinating, the only other option we have is separation and management. And we all do that to the very best of our ability.
We have a lot of areas where winter range is on private property, which kind of coincides with the high risk period. But those are some of our concerns, that we've got large groups of elk congregating in somewhat unnatural type situations in areas where we just don't have a lot of authority to manage those. Obviously, if they come down to areas that are in private ownership, that puts them potentially in greater contact with domestic livestock. So the challenge is how to change that behavior to get them to use landscape like they did before and spend less time down there on winter range.
Now, why this is all a problem for us is because you cannot monitor every single move they make, what piece of ground they sniffed. You have no way of knowing in their grazing patterns whether or not any of your cattle have come across anything. You don't know which elk are diseased either. So you have to assume all of them are sick, because all it takes is one. There are so many ways for our cattle to be infected, and I'm not sure people really understand the ramifications of an infection now.
When we first detect an affected herd, that herd is immediately quarantined. We get rid of the positive animals in the herd. We conduct a whole herd test. And then we conduct another whole herd test 6 months later, and then another whole herd test 6 months after that. During this time, the producer remains quarantined. He or she has very limited options for selling their livestock. So really that individual undergoes a significant amount of hardship to try to get rid of that disease.
We have in the past recently tried to use things like hazing when elk were coming in close to areas where cattle were present. We tried to haze those elk to different areas, but the problem with that is you have to have some place to put those elk. You can't just chase them from one landowner to another, because really all you're doing is transferring that problem.
There aren't any avenues open to you other than what you're doing, which is trying to maintain separation and manage your herd accordingly. That's all we can do, and that's not very many tools in the toolbox to save yourself from an infection. The reason why people have come, especially to the Paradise Valley, is because of the beautiful views, wonderful amount of wildlife viewing, but truly the biggest is open space. If we can't survive the disease, and it becomes when we get the disease, then agriculture disappears from the landscape. And if that happens, your open space is gone. And the Paradise Valley takes on a totally different look than what it has now. Maybe that's the look people want. But they didn't term this as the last best place to get rid of agriculture. They did it because agriculture was here and provided the last best place.